John Hutchinson was born into dire poverty, with his family barely surviving. His father worked various odd jobs to make ends meet, but they were often left hungry. Such hardships were common among the poor in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and it often led to many individuals experiencing deep depression. John's family were no exception. Before John was born, the family experienced the loss of many family members due to the circumstances they found themselves in. Tragically, his uncles, cousin and 2 aunts all took their own lives. Some other family members were committed to an asylum. The family clearly struggled with persistent mental health issues. However, it would take a few more years before the pleas for help from the less fortunate were acknowledged. Growing up in such an environment must have been tough for John. He often sought solace by spending extended periods alone, a habit that began in his early years and became more frequent as he got older. Perhaps it was his way of trying to break free from his bleak surroundings, just for a little while. When John was 21 years old, he was hit by a horse and carriage. A panicked horse kicked John multiple times in the back and head. They thought this could possibly have contributed to his seizures he began to experience after the incident, but they were never diagnosed. He self-medicated with alcohol by drinking heavily. However, his seizures increased in frequency, eventually forcing him to quit his job in the coal mines due to the risk it posed, not just to himself but to his fellow workers. He eventually fell into labouring work, as it was the only other profession he knew, but due to his health he found it difficult to stay in one place for long. In the winter of 1904 he found lodgings at the poverty-stricken Chapman's Yard, Malt Mill Lane, Narrow Marsh, in Nottingham. He lived and worked here until he lost his job as a plate layer on the railways. Not knowing what to do now, he decided to join up, so he joined the Sherwood Foresters Regiment. While at the Normanton Barracks, and after only 6 weeks, he had caused so many problems within the regiment that the regiment officers came to the conclusion that he was totally unsuitable and he was forced to leave. So by the end of January 1905, he once again found himself homeless and jobless. But George and Rose Matthews lived in Narrow Marsh, Nottingham. They had previously let Hutchinson lodge with them. Knowing that he was out of work but had a little money, they decided he could stay and help towards the rent. In the meantime, he would help babysit their 4-year-old son, Albert, while the father, George, looked for work and Rose went to do her laundry work. John and the young Albert were comfortable in each other's company and they seemed to get on. A week after his discharge from the Foresters on the 31st of January, he agreed with Rose and George to be back in time around 5:30 p.m. to put Albert to bed. George would be back soon after, and Rose informed him she'd be back from her work around 8 p.m. John would often go back out again when George returned. After spending most of the day drinking, John staggered into the Miller's Arms, where George Matthews had just entered before returning home. After seeing the time, he told John to get home and sober up, as he was supposed to be watching young Albert. When he got to the house, young Albert was in a playful mood. Hutchinson tried to calm him down. Unfortunately, Hutchinson wasn't in the mood for his boisterousness. It's not entirely clear why, but Albert picked up a poker from the fireplace and lashed out at Hutchinson. Hutchinson's response to this was beyond extreme. He grabbed the boy by the neck and slowly squeezed. The boy's body went limp as he took his last breath. Hutchinson then grabbed a knife from the kitchen and hacked the boy's head off. After kicking the head under the sofa, he began slashing and mutilating the boy's body before dropping him in front of the fireplace and walking out. At around 6:30 p.m, he returned to the Miller's Arms and ordered a pint. He spoke to George, telling him he was off to see his sister who had been sick, and he left around 7 p.m. An hour later Rose returned home. She saw a child laying on the floor close to the fire. Blood covered the room, and she screamed one of those guttural, heart-wrenching screams that pierced the air. Neighbours Thomas Rook and Joseph Heap ran to help the screaming woman as she ran into the street. Not able to calm her, they broke down the door of her home, and what they saw would live with them for the rest of their lives. Constable Tuxford was out on his beat when Hutchinson calmly walked over to him and gave himself up. The constable knew nothing of the murder, but while escorting him to the station, he met Superintendent Parnham, who had been called out to the Matthews house. He went on to tell the constable what had happened. Both looking at Hutchinson, they took him to Leenside police station. After being formally charged, he was taken to the Guildhall. A dazed but calm Hutchinson didn't deny the charges against him. He seemed remorseless, showing little to no emotion. When Hutchinson was taken before the judge, Mr. Justice Phillimore, on the 9th of March 1905, his defence team, led by Dr. Tarashand, entered a plea of not guilty on the grounds of insanity. Tarashand thought this the best option when hearing of his family background and his state of health after the horse incident. Due to the severity of the attack on the boy, Hutchinson, it was claimed, must have been mentally unstable to commit such a terrible crime. Dr. Herbert Taylor had examined both Hutchinson after the act and had examined the boy, stating he saw no sign of insanity in Hutchinson, as he was able to tell him in detail what had happened. Nor had he seen any signs, after relaying that he had interviewed Hutchinson at some length. He went on to state that Hutchinson had known exactly what had happened, giving him as many details as he could. He showed no remorse, and he was conscious of what he had done, which was, to him, sufficient evidence he was not insane. Dr. Tarashand continued with his insanity theory, claiming that because of Hutchinson's family background with insanity in the family, it was possible that it had passed down to Hutchinson. He also claimed that Hutchinson had epileptic fits that had been made worse after he had been in an accident with the horse. This was also backed up by Dr. Edge after interviewing Hutchinson in prison. He agreed that the mutilation after was consistent with a type of insanity. It all sounded credible, and that could have been enough to get John Hutchinson off. But then came Dr. Powell, medical superintendent of the city asylum, and Dr. O'Kell, who was chief medical officer at Bagthorpe Prison, who had been observing and interviewing Hutchinson for the 5 weeks he had been in there. Their expertise in this area of insanity blew apart Dr. Tarashand's claim. In summing up, Mr. Justice Phillimore stated that insanity was a difficult condition to prove. It had to fit a certain criteria. That a man was sane if he knew the nature and quality of the act, if he knew it was morally wrong. In other words, it must be proved by those who put forward the plea that he was so insane that he did not know the nature and quality of the act he was doing, in cases where crimes were perpetrated by epileptic maniacs. They were not conscious of what they had done. In this, the man remembered practically everything. There was no evidence that the prisoner had shown any clear signs of insanity. The jury took 20 minutes to agree with these points, and they found John Hutchinson guilty. Henry Pierpoint hanged him on the 29th of March 1905 at Bagthorpe Prison. In May 1909, 30-year-old former soldier Samuel Atherley and his girlfriend of 7 years, 27-year-old Matilda Lambert, had been living in Bond Street, Arnold, Nottingham, for a number of years. Matilda had 3 children, John 8, and Atherley's biological children, Annie 5 and Samuel 2. Although Atherley, a bricklayer's labourer, was already a married man, he had left his wife to be with Matilda. By all accounts, it was a tumultuous relationship. According to their neighbours, they were constantly arguing. Samuel, a highly jealous man, inexplicably started suspecting that his young daughter Annie was fathered by John Watson, the brother-in-law of Matilda. The reason behind the suspicion remains unclear. However, it triggered an ongoing violent dispute between Samuel and Matilda. Sarah Watson, Matilda's sister, would go on to claim to others that Atherley was an extremely violent and jealous man, and she feared for her sister. Matilda left Atherley and stayed with her sister on more than 4 occasions. She confided in her sister that he would sulk for days, even weeks, without speaking to her, but she would always return to him. A few weeks before the murder, Matilda left once more, taking the children with her. She chose to move into a new home on her own and found accommodations at Robertson's yard in Arnold. It was reported that Atherley would frequently visit the house and eventually firmly planted his feet back under the table. But things didn't change, and Atherley's jealousy would become extreme. He once again accused Matilda of having an affair with a man called John Shelton. This wasn't the case, and Matilda had had enough. This time she was adamant that the relationship was over and Atherley must move out. On the 9th of July, the landlady of the house recalled Atherley and Matilda having another blazing row after she had told him he needed to leave. But he wouldn't go, and Matilda couldn't get him out of the house. The landlady saw him a little while later, cutting a stick in the yard, and told him he should be ashamed of himself for causing so many arguments. The next morning, around 7:30 a.m. on the 10th of July, another neighbour, Thomas Marriott, heard knocking and saw Atherley at Matilda's bedroom window. Atherley waved at him to come. At first the neighbour ignored him, but then he saw Atherley smash the window and he noticed what looked like blood. The neighbour ran, calling for help as he did so. He tried to get in the door, but it wasn't until Atherley opened the door that the neighbour could enter. His first sight was Atherley with his hand holding his throat. The neighbour helped him to sit and gave him a rag to stop the bleeding. As blood was dripping through his fingers, the concerned neighbour began to look for Matilda and the children. He called out for her. Not getting any reply, he went upstairs. What he found would live with him for the rest of his life. Matilda and Annie were laying on the bed with their throats cut, blood soaking the clothes that had been placed on their undressed bodies. The 2 young boys were on a smaller bed. Their throats were also cut. Matilda and her 3 children were dead. After calling for the police and a doctor, the neighbour noticed a razor that seemed to have blood on it laying on top of the fireplace. This was promptly taken by the police as evidence. When the doctor, local GP Harvey Francis, examined the bodies, he noticed not only that the cuts had been done with some force, but that the heads, except the youngest, Samuel, had signs of being hit with a blunt instrument. But he was uncertain whether it was before or after their throats had been cut. They all displayed signs that suggested they might have been asleep when they had been struck on the head with a coal hammer, which was later found. The distinct shape of the hammer matched the wounds he discovered. PC's Lomas and Lowe arrested him, and on the journey to the hospital, Atherley admitted to the killings and that he had tried to take his own life. When the doctor asked Atherley what time he had killed his family, he apparently held up 3 fingers to indicate 3 a.m. After a delay, while a defence counsel was found for Atherley, the trial began on the 12th of November 1909. It was held before Mr. Justice Pickford and a crowded courtroom. The defence team had little to go on. The only defence that could be used was insanity. But that was rejected as there was no evidence to support the claim. Dr. Francis clearly stated to the court that he observed no remorse from the prisoner. Furthermore, The prisoner did not acknowledge the seriousness of his situation and had, on multiple occasions, dismissed it as mere jealousy. The prosecution, Mr. Ryland Atkins, jumped on this and stated that jealousy had been the cause of many murders, but it did not mean that person was insane. After hearing all the witnesses' statements and the statement that Atherley had given himself, admitting to the crime, the jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to hang and taken back to Bagthorpe Prison. After a failed appeal, Samuel Atherley was hanged on December the 14th, 1909 at 8 a.m, the hangmen being Henry Pierpoint, assisted by Thomas Pierpoint. Thomas Greensmith. On July the 22nd, 1837, 35-year-old Thomas Greensmith would stand trial in front of Sir James Allen Park for the wilful murder of his 4 children at Basford in Nottingham. Widower Greensmith, a labourer, lived in Basford with his 4 children, John, William, Anne and Mark. They were aged 9, 7, 5 and 2. On the morning of the 5th of April, neighbours made a grim discovery. All the children were found dead. Their bodies were still warm. The house was empty, as Greensmith had dismissed the woman who assisted with the household chores the night before. Greensmith himself had also left the home at a very early hour, making his way to Lamley, where he was eventually apprehended. In his testimony before the coroner, Mr. Swan, Greensmith revealed a profound reasoning behind his drastic actions. He claimed that he felt compelled to commit the heinous act because he believed it was in the best interest of the children. Greensmith expressed deep concern that if the children were to survive, they would be left in a state of deprivation and need. Furthermore, he disclosed that he had been facing significant financial troubles, exacerbated by the threat of having his possessions seized by his landlord due to unpaid rent. These circumstances weighed heavily on Greensmith, adding to the complex motivations behind his tragic decision. He was found guilty and sentenced to hang, until 2 doctors, Dr. Blake and Mr. H. Attenborough, were convinced that the man was insane, so a representation of the case was made to Lord John Russell, the then Secretary of State, that his lordship commute the sentence to perpetual imprisonment. The backstory. Widower Thomas Greensmith had moved his family into a cottage in Basford, Nottingham. He had managed to get a job as a bleacher and placed his 9-year-old son in a rope yard. They earned a modest income that covered their needs. He made an agreement to prepare meals for his father-in-law, who would in turn pay him a weekly fee of 6 shillings. Anne Fryer, a woman in need of housing, found a suitable arrangement as a housekeeper for Greensmith. She managed household duties and cared for the children. However, unexpectedly in April, Thomas informed her that their agreement was terminated and she had to find another place to live, as he intended to hire someone else. On the 3rd of April, after eating supper with his father-in-law, Thomas went out for his evening drink. Later that night, Anne Fry was woken by the landlord's father and Mr. Woodward, demanding rent. She was shocked and asked him to wait for Mr. Greensmith to return home. He wouldn't wait, but just as he was about to leave, Thomas came home. As they stepped aside from Anne, Woodward informed Thomas that he must settle the rent arrears by 9 a.m. the following morning. There appeared to be a misunderstanding regarding the rent, as Thomas believed it was not due until the next Wednesday. An argument followed, and Thomas was told that if the arrears were not paid, Woodward would seize his goods and evict the family. That night, Thomas made Anne leave the cottage. Thomas Greensmith sat in front of the fire in complete darkness. At around 1 a.m, he took a candle and walked slowly to his children's rooms. He gently kissed each of them on the forehead, took a handkerchief from his pocket, and he slowly moved over to the youngest of the children, placed a handkerchief round her neck and took her life. Shaking from the shock of what he had done, he made the terrible decision, stated in his own words, "I might as well suffer for them all and take all their lives." He went back to the bedroom where one of the remaining boys was awake. Trembling in fear, he jumped into the bed where his two dead siblings lay. Greensmith went over to his son. William shouted, but this didn't stop Greensmith as he finished off the last of his children. The next morning, a young boy who worked with John went to knock on the door so they could walk together to work, as they always did. A neighbour saw the boy knocking a few times and thought this odd, as the housekeeper, Anne, would have opened the door by now. She went over and pushed at the door. It opened, and she made her way inside. She called out for Anne. There was no reply from the house at all. She began to feel something bad had happened. Walking into the bedroom, she noticed blankets covering small childlike shapes, and pulling back the blankets, she screamed and ran out the house crying for help. Dr. William Morley made an examination and confirmed all 4 children had been strangled. Where was Thomas? Thomas Greensmith had walked to Nottingham, then continued on to Lamley. He walked into a pub, the Robin Hood, where he knew the landlord, John Brownlow, who noted Thomas seemed dazed and a little confused. He had stayed in the pub with his friend until Brownlow's sister ran into the bar shouting about the murders in Basford. It was then that Brownlow realised what Greensmith had done. A shocked Brownlow quietly went out and fetched Collishaw, the local policeman. The policeman sat and talked to Greensmith, who told him everything he needed to know. At court on the 22nd of July 1837, the Honourable Sir James Allen Park presided over the trial at Nottingham Summer Assizes. Greensmith had no legal representative, so it was up to the judge to make sure he wasn't tried unfairly. The prosecution stated that they could only find him insane if he didn't know at that time what he was doing was right or wrong. Greensmith said, after the landlord had threatened to evict him, he feared for his children. He said, "I was not willing to part with my children, and I strangled them with my handkerchief. The threat that Mr. Woodward gave me caused me to do what I did." Henry Attenborough, the general surgeon to the county jail, was brought to testify. It had been his job to determine Greensmith's mental state while in prison. According to Attenborough, he saw something was amiss with the prisoner from the first time he saw him. He gave his testament, claiming, "The pupils of his eyes were much dilated, and there was great anxiety and wildness about their expression, and that irritation had continued since. The tongue, too, was far from healthy, but in that peculiar state which indicates insanity. Judging from all of the circumstances of the case, was decidedly of the opinion that the man was insane at the time of the perpetration of the act." But the judge found this unacceptable. P.C. Wilkinson was put on the stand and told of the pair of boots Greensmith had taken off his son after he had died. Greensmith went on to sell the boots. This showed the court Greensmith had been aware of what he had done. After 12 minutes, the jury found him guilty and he was sentenced to hang. After some heated debates as to Thomas Greensmith's mental state, the doctors took the case to Lord John Russell, the then Secretary of State. His lordship commuted the sentence to perpetual imprisonment.